Our world is changing rapidly. New ideas, new concepts, new technologies. The technologies around us provide more and more data. For most of us, there's almost too much data available. At the same time, number and severity of extreme weather event increases, creating new societal, environmental and economic challenges. At this time of uncertainty, the importance of accurate and reliable observations and forecasts is increasing. We need reliable and accurate data to make smart, considered decisions. Only accurate data enables us to understand and act upon the most pressing challenges, for example in trade, national security, health and infrastructure. At Vaisala, we help our customers to establish weather and environmental observation networks and to respond to environmental challenges that affect our daily lives. The goal for all of us is to build a sustainable future for our planet and to improve water, food, energy and health security. Only together we can rise to the challenge of innovating different approaches for science, policy and practice, thus improving the quality of life, safety and sustainability, whatever the weather brings us.
Climate change and extreme weather, energy consumption and emissions, global health threats, resource scarcity. From a 1930s startup to a global measurement technology leader, Vaisala has always been a visionary pioneer. By teaming up brilliant minds and cutting-edge technologies, we co-create innovative solutions to measure, analyze, and act for a better world. With our product and technology leadership, we answer to the growing need for quality, reliability, and productivity. We enable business-critical operations and decisions where it truly matters. We see a future where accurate observations and forecasts help protect lives and infrastructure, where reliable production chains in life science and other industries tackle health challenges of growing populations, and where optimized generation and use of clean and renewable energy, as well as improved industrial production, maximize the use of our planet's scarce resources. An eye into the invisible. That is our contribution to the world.
Good evening, good afternoon, welcome to the 102nd annual meeting of the American Meteorological Society. We're really thrilled to be here in the city of Houston, the nation's fourth largest city, and by the latest census, the most diverse city in America. Of all places that have experienced environmental security impacts, you can't talk about more of it than Houston. I'm sure the mayor, we were happy to have here, Mayor Sylvester Turner, will be sharing those with his remarks. We have a world-class panel today to go ahead and talk with you about this. It's going to be made up of professionals from the UN, the administration, think tanks, and of course from the local perspective and broader, our Mayor of Houston. So with that, I'd like to introduce, we're going to go through a little bit here. First of all, I'd like to make a note for those who are watching online that we do have safe space up here on the podium, so we'll be speaking masks off, but everybody's safe in the audience, all masked up as according to our protocol. We're going to have 5 speakers, at which point at the end we'll have a little time for Q&A. Our first speaker will also provide a little extended remarks to give you a primer, a little bit of an introduction to what environmental security means and why it's important to the world and then to us specifically as atmospheric and earth system scientists here in the AMS. With that, I'd like to introduce our panel. We'll go one at a time. And we have the, are we ready to go on the screen? I'm going to read the actual bio here because I want to make sure I get all this right. So we're going to start off with Ms. Sherry Goodman, who's been sometimes referred to as the godmother of environmental security, who's been a thought leader in this for decades. She comes to us from a senior fellow from the Polar Institute in the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Institute for Scholars, and also a leader at the Environmental Change and Security Program. She comes to us from as senior strategist from the Center for Climate and Security, and is also the secretary of the General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. So she has the national, international perspective. With that, I'd like to invite Sherry, who's going to join us remotely.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. I only regret that I can't be with you there today in Houston. I would have very much welcomed that. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, especially for welcoming your great city. It is indeed a great city. That is a perfect place to host this conference as we think about what environmental security means in the modern era. And I recall when I first started working in this field back in the 1990s with, I hope some of you who are on the line now, it was an era when we were closing military bases after the Cold War. Many of them were in Texas and around Houston. And we were working with the former Soviet Union to help rid them of nuclear weapons. How the world has changed in the last several decades. We were working to clean up contamination, and we were using the work of the meteorology community to more precisely understand military operations around the world and plan for a changed world. We were also using your work very much to manage the natural resources of the planet, of our cities, of our military. And in many ways, we have done a fair good job, let's say, from a local level in maintaining ecosystems. But at a national level, we are now entering into a biodiversity crisis. Now we have find ourselves moving into understanding better the connections between climate and global security. And for the last at least 15 years, since the first group of generals and admirals came together to understand climate change as a threat multiplier, we have had a growing focus on understanding the national security implications of climate change and what it means for our world. And that has taken sort of front and center now at the local, national, and international level. And that's why I think what we're joined together to address today and throughout this conference is so fundamental. And let me say, when I think about the broader field of climate and security, it is inclusive of many of the topics that will be covered in this conference, from the growing focus on health security, the threat multipliers of changing disease vectors and infectious disease. COVID has shown us how unprepared we are for infectious disease crisis and how closely linked is our health, our climate, and our security. Also, growing food insecurity around the world. I'm so pleased to see so much of that on this agenda as well, because what we are learning through mounting evidence of increasing drought and water insecurity is how our food systems globally are threatened with rising temperatures and changing access to food in many underserved places of the world. And then, we can't leave out water, too much of it, or not enough of it. And we have both in critical places and globally, and we've seen how not enough water, drought, prolonged drought in the Sahel and parts of Syria has led directly to the conflagrations in certain regions. And that is something that we need better to understand and plan for the future. And I know this community is very much involved in doing that. And then, of course, extreme weather events. That is, you've always planned for hurricanes or volcanoes and cyclones and tsunamis, but now we see them coming at a more rapid rate with more intensity and cascading events, compounding risks. In the military, we used to plan for two major regional conflicts back in the 1990s, one in the Pacific and one in Europe. Okay, and now we could see combination of major regional conflicts around the world, as well as an increasing demand on our military forces to support natural disasters here at home. And we've seen that in the last several years. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, noted not long ago that there's been almost a tenfold demand in person hours required by the National Guard over the last few years to respond to natural disasters, both climate-fueled, COVID needs, and our own democracy. We shouldn't leave out how fragile that is at the present time and how important we have to think about all of these efforts. So let me go back now to the sort of, we start at the local level because we're there. Let's assume we're there in Houston. I wish I were. It's a lot warmer than where I am right now. But our cities are the sort of incubators of resilience today. And that is what I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the mayor. But I say that's also the case with our military infrastructure. And that's an important role that the meteorological community plays in helping our military bases in the US and around the world better prepare for the events like the hurricane that struck Tyndall Air Force Base, Hurricane Michael a few years ago, as well as Hurricane Harvey in Houston, and the hurricane that damaged Camp Lejeune and the flooding that damaged Offutt Air Force Base, all resulting in billions of dollars of damage and in some cases, tragic loss of life. So better being able to predict those, not only the singular events, but the compounding risks that flow from that. And then as we work at the national level to better understand how we're going to manage this tension now we face between what the home game is, our increasing need for natural disaster response at home, and the ability to protect our force and protect democracy abroad, the away game. And then we have the tension between how we allocate our investments between responding to the event. We're investing billions of dollars now to rebuild Tyndall Air Force Base, but we have many other bases, for example, that we also need to ensure our resilience. So we need to prepare. So as we say, getting sort of left of boom, and it's the preparedness and prevention mindset is even more important. I know my friend and colleague Alice has focused a great deal on that across the whole of society. I'm somewhat modestly hopeful that in the defense and meteorology and the oceanographic community, we have with the planning culture of the military the ability to do that and to reset our forces to be able to address this both at the local and the national and at the international level. Now, that's where we need to really join forces with our allies and partners in better understanding both the risks. And I will tip my hat here to my colleague Roger Olwardy, with whom and others of you, who's been working the last several years on a project on improving predictive capabilities for disruptive national security events with environmental causes and climate and water and energy fueled. And that in many ways has allowed us to understand how, as Roger would say, risk is socially constructed. But at the same time, the compounding and the cascading risk and understanding the integration of the physical consequences with the transboundary consequences and the transnational consequences. And in many ways, some of the documents from the Biden administration focusing on the Defense Climate Risk Assessment, and now the first ever Climate National Intelligence Estimate, both give us healthy guides to how better to understand those risks and how to plan and prepare for them. And that's why those elements, and particularly understanding now how the changing geopolitics of the energy transition are going to, in some ways, exacerbate some of the short-term risks as we move away from fossil fuels. Some assets get stranded in certain places. And then there are supply chain issues that we also need to cope with. So the complexities of that and the stress on the system. And the awesome thing at the end, I'll just say, the future here is really closer than we think. And that's why we need not to suffer from a failure of imagination. And I'm so pleased and honored that we have Jane Luchenko here with us as well, because Jane is right at the center of helping us better understand these risks and integrate the science with the climate services as we move towards making this information more usable to a variety of sectors that you all serve, from security, which I call my home, but also in transportation, in health, and across many sectors of society. And I think this is going to enable us to create a more robust and broader framed environmental security system that also at the end of the day moves us towards a greater concept of ecological security, which is health of the planet as well as all of us who populate it. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today.
All right, thank you much, Sherry. We're now going to go to our next panelists, and the next four, we're going to organize them in the sequence, kind of starting from their primary jobs now, from the international to the national to the regional, and then ending with the mayor with the local. But you'll notice that on all four of their sets of remarks, they're all involved at all of these levels. So it's a very integrated approach from all those that I think you're going to find very interesting. So our next speaker is Mami Mitsutori. She is the Special Representative to the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, sometimes referred to as UNDRR. And she's the Director of the Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, formerly UNSDA. So I would like to please bring Mami onto the screen, and I ask her to provide her opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Mr. Mayor, like Sherry said, I would have really wanted to be in Houston, but my heart and soul is there. So ladies and gentlemen, in the last few years, as Sherry has just mentioned, our world has been pummeled by a disease we were not prepared for. But this is important. In 2015, when the UN member states came together to negotiate and agree on the global blueprint for disaster risk reduction and resilience, a document called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, actually biological hazards were indeed incorporated as the next big hazard we need to protect ourselves from. So we can't say that we didn't think about this. And now COVID has left hardly anyone or any aspect of our lives untouched. Although the overwhelming number of disasters in the last 50 years, about 90%, have been related indeed to extreme weather events, COVID, with its abrupt arrival and universal impact, this has been a stark reminder that we are living in a world where risk is interconnected with cascading impacts. And as risk multiplies, their impacts affect whole communities, whole systems. Global impacts become local, local impacts become global, and they penetrate across sectors, creating new challenges, and uncertainty has become the new normal. But in a world of uncertainty, some things are very certain. If we want to achieve sustainable development, We need to better understand the nature of risk that is surrounding us, and we need to make prudent choices now. Our goal at UNDRR, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is to support countries minimize losses from disaster through investment in preparation and prevention before a hazard becomes a disaster. There are numerous ways we can take action in the face of future pandemics and climate emergency, and I would like to offer a few ideas today. First, our financial and governance systems need to account for the true cost of our own actions. This is a huge challenge, but one tool that can help is systemic risk modeling, which is built on innovation in modeling systemic financial crisis. These models can help us better understand how risk cascades throughout different sectors, different geographies, disrupting key systems like food system, infrastructure, and supply chains, and further drive social impacts such as forced migration and conflict. UNDRR is working with governments of both developed and developing countries, academia, civil society, the private sector, and of course the youth to improve access to these analytics and data. Second, we need to find and implement solutions together as we all ultimately have the same interest, which is to have a sustainable planet that supports human thriving. It is only through our combined knowledge and efforts, including robust global partnerships, that we will and we can make the most progress. Given the importance of local resilience with cities at the front line of all disasters at UNDRR, one such partnership that we are trying to take forward globally is to make the focus on resilient cities. So along with 11 global partners, we are helping cities stand prepared for the next disaster through a program called Making Cities Resilient 2030. This is an online platform which offers a dashboard to connect with networks, information, and service providers. And we would like to encourage all cities to explore this option. Third, our mantra at UNDRR is this: resilience is a wise investment. It is not an extra cost. One such investment is in early warning systems. The United States has some wonderful early warning tools that are saving lives and mitigating losses. An app called Shake Alert helps citizens on the West Coast to take cover before an earthquake. In Houston, a radar-based flood assessment, mapping, and early warning system helps emergency managers better address multi-risk situations such as COVID and flooding coming together. This pioneering work will pay countless dividends, and our hope is to see these systems proliferate throughout the world, including, importantly, in the developing world where many countries are still in dire need. Here again, strong partnerships, strategic investment, and shared knowledge is invaluable. We need more solidarity. Without it, we cannot overcome any of the crises that we are facing. No doubt, few among us like seeing rising prices, but faltering supply chains could do a good job actually, of reminding us of our interdependence and that working together is a necessity and not an option. The COVID virus instigated this chain reaction, but with effects still unfolding, it's a story still being written. Supply chains might become more regional and thus less polluting. Companies may get more focused on their business contingency plans, and the world may ultimately take risk and disasters more seriously. COVID could become our opportunity to make the paradigm shift from trying to always manage and responding to disasters after they break us to managing disaster risks by investing in resilience before hazards become disasters. We need to break out from this vicious cycle of disaster response, recovery, reconstruction, and disaster again. In the era of climate emergency, systemic risk, and compounded disasters, we cannot afford to waste any disaster, and certainly not one which is as powerful as this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, those comments and that perspective. We're going to shift now to our third speaker, the Honorable Jane Lubchenco. Dr. Lubchenco is the Deputy Director for Climate and Environment at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, and that is the office that is often referred to as the President's Science Advisor. And so we'd like to welcome Jane to give her remarks now. Thank you so much.
Mr. Mayor, distinguished panelists, AMS colleagues, it's really a great treat to join you today. Thank you so much, Mike, and congratulations on elevating environmental security as the theme for the 102nd AMS annual meeting. The term environmental security encapsulates the challenges that AMS members embrace in their research, observations, and services. And it anchors much of what we focus on, excuse me, in my climate and environment team at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So this forum really provides an opportunity to reflect on the changing nature of our planet and the need for fresh approaches to address the unprecedented challenges facing our communities, our nation, and the world. Delivering on the promise of improving lives and livelihoods, creating jobs, addressing inequities, and making our world more secure requires us to recognize the interdependence of people and nature, to view our coupled human and natural world as a series of complex adaptive systems, to focus on making these coupled systems more resilient with good outcomes, and to act on the knowledge that the past is no longer a good predictor of the future. Indeed, now is a fundamentally different time than ever before. We live in a no analog world. Achieving a more secure world requires broadening our thinking and actions to include the stability of the global climate system, the health of our lands, waters, and ecosystems, and the relationships among humans and between humans and the environment. It requires understanding that social justice, economic growth, global security, and environmental sustainability are intimately interconnected, and it requires holistic, not reductionist thinking. One need look no further than our host city of Houston, which was devastated by Hurricane Harvey in 2017, followed by Nicholas in 2021, to see the interdependencies, cascading impacts, and unprecedented nature of today's challenges. I'm delighted we have the opportunity to hear today from Houston's mayor. Those tragic events join a litany of other extreme weather, water, and climate catastrophes, from devastating floods and wildfires to extreme heat and drought. Indeed, over the past decade, NOAA estimates that extreme weather events have caused over $1 trillion in damages in the US alone. And we know all too painfully that the impacts are so much greater. Behind the dollar statistics are people, families, their health, livelihoods, homes, and culture. So we can no longer afford silos or retrograde approaches. Yet we often retreat to what we know, what we're used to thinking and doing. Being stuck is not conducive to meeting challenges head on. So it's time to embrace complexity, to accept uncertainty, to diversify approaches and diversify problem solvers. So you might ask, what does that look like? Well, on the conceptual side, I've already hinted at the need to understand the world as a nested set of complex adaptive systems, coupled social, economic, and environmental systems. And this holistic approach recognizes that patterns at higher levels of organization emerge from localized interactions and selection processes that act at those lower levels. Paramount in this framing is the need to tighten the feedback loops between actions and consequences or outcomes, and the overarching importance of focusing on resilience of the system, not just the components. Maintaining the resilience of ecosystems so they can continue to deliver our life support system benefits is as important as making our built infrastructure more resilient. On the practical side, this forward-looking approach means building trusted, useful, and frequently updated information services so that families, communities, businesses, and government agencies can prepare. It means strengthening effective early warning systems for disasters and making our green and gray infrastructure disaster ready. But it also means building trusted relationships. And it means enabling institutions to be nimble and flexible with rapid bi-directional flow of information and facile adjustment to new knowledge. And across these approaches, it means expecting surprises and building redundancy to avoid catastrophic collapse of key functions. Key to all of these enabling capacities will be diversifying the problem solvers. Now, in some instances, we need new knowledge to address these challenges. But the truth is that much of our current knowledge is not used. The bipartisan infrastructure bill the President signed into law in October provides a golden opportunity to begin to put existing knowledge into action while also creating new knowledge. Federal agencies are actively working to enhance resilience in the face of climate-related threats. The $50 billion in funding for resilience projects includes accelerating flood protection projects, updating aging infrastructure, boosting pre-disaster mitigation programs, and enhancing weather and climate information. As we've learned from COVID-19, building resilience requires not only strengthening our infrastructure, but addressing fundamental vulnerabilities within our communities. And that's why key components of the Build Back Better legislation are also urgently needed to strengthen communities. Security threats often arise from inequity. Investments are needed to enhance resilience for everyone, and that means they must be designed by everyone. And that's why the President's Justice 40 initiative is so important, by ensuring that federal investments target those communities most in need. We can avoid marginalized groups and communities of color from being left behind. As we move forward with this more robust vision of resilience, we must acknowledge that we are pushing up against the limits of our knowledge, gaps that limit our foresight regarding emerging risks, diagnosis of cause and effect, and therefore our ability to design and implement policies that are robust to the complexities of global changes. At OSTP, we're being asked how agencies should efficiently and consistently evaluate infrastructure projects for their climate resilience. How should the financial sector evaluate climate risks for investigators? How should we elevate our resilience efforts to know what works and then share that knowledge with others? And this is exactly why I have challenged the U.S. Global Change Research Program to accelerate their efforts to produce the most urgently needed knowledge and to enhance efforts to make that knowledge useful. I thank those of you who are already tackling these problems, and I invite even more AMS members to help. I'm excited about the potential for scientists rising to these challenges, and I'm delighted to see scientific and practitioner communities coming together with passion, concern, open minds, and a willingness to embrace new approaches, new collaborations, new thinking. Their attitude mirrors Albert Einstein's sentiment that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. So make no mistake, the challenges are unprecedented and daunting. But I look to the AMS community to help deliver the systemic innovation strategies we need to collaborate across disciplines and partner with users to create, share, and use the knowledge, awareness, and action that we need to enhance the well-being of people and the planet. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Chinko, for those thoughtful comments. We're going to move on now to Alice Hill. I'm happy to introduce her. She is the David N. Ruthstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also the co-chair of the California Climate Insurance Working Group. So it goes, obviously their impacts, I think, goes beyond the state borders of California. So this is a perspective we have not heard a lot before. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from you. So Alice, would you please come on and provide your comments?
Thank you so much for having me here today, Mike. It's really my honor to share this panel with these esteemed panelists. And thank you, Mayor Turner, for hosting this group in your wonderful city. I too, of course, wish I could be there with you. It's a remarkable occasion. Today, the AMS was founded in 1919, 102 years ago. I can't help but think back on those first attendees. They were, of course, emerging from the devastation of World War I, and they too were dealing with a rampaging pandemic that had killed millions across the globe. That group could only dream of the technology that is at our fingertips now and in our homes. But in the past century, new developments have greatly affected our environment in ways that most would not have foreseen and would not have had an opportunity to address. Of course, each of us has had a front row seat in dealing with our pandemic in our century. But this century, particularly the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, have seen climate change impacts batter the world in a way that no humans have ever witnessed before. This crowd could probably recite by memory the string of devastating events that have cut across all regions and all borders. From the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, where a town in Canada experienced temperatures higher than any ever recorded in Florida, to European flooding that exceeded any before in Germany. According to the reinsurer Munich Re, natural disasters caused significantly more financial damage worldwide in 2021 compared with the previous 2 years. Based on their provisional data, overall losses caused by natural disasters came to $280 billion in 2021, compared with $210 billion in 2020. And $166 billion in 2019. And of course, the United States owned a large portion of those losses. Approximately $145 billion due to tornadoes, tropical storms, and freezes. So we're getting walloped by climate change. And that is revealing a deep vulnerability that wouldn't have been obvious to those scientists 100 years ago. They were doing what we're doing. They were basing future decisions on what we had experienced in the past. But because virtually all of our infrastructure is built to the climate of the past, we are seeing compounding, failing infrastructure that causes cascading damages across our society, and that is threatening homeland security. It threatens us in our livelihoods, our ability to recover, our public health, our public safety. Climate impacts, whether they're slow moving like drought and sea level rise, or acute like the wildfires that California is experiencing in winter today in the iconic Big Sur region. Those impacts affect everything, and we are not prepared. So what are we to do? There are numerous barriers that have held back progress on climate change, but one I think is particularly important for this audience to keep in mind as it works forward on figuring out what will be most helpful for communities, decision makers to plan and prepare for climate change impacts. As the panelists have described, this is needed, urgently needed. The first is that we should pay attention to how humans assess catastrophic risk. We're not particularly good at it. And the social scientists have told us there are all sorts of reasons for that. Our tendency to judge risk based on what we have personally experienced, to suffer from availability bias. If we don't know it, we don't think could happen. We also tend to be optimists, which is a wonderful thing, but we don't believe it could get as bad as it can get. In short, we routinely suffer from a failure of imagination, and that failure has been proven to be a high vulnerability, whether it's from our failure to anticipate the Pearl Harbor attack during the preceding World War II, the entry of the United States. The after-action reports there all said it was a failure of imagination. We couldn't imagine being attacked from the Pacific. Similarly, after 9/11, one of the major findings of the 9/11 Commission was that the United States suffered a lack of imagination. We simply couldn't imagine two planes flying into those World Trade Center buildings. So with climate change, I'm afraid most of us still suffer from a lack of imagination. And that's why it's so important for those who have access to the information, who understand what is at stake, make it comprehensible, understandable, and actionable for those who have to make the hard decisions about how to prepare their communities. We need to stop fighting the last war or building the bridge to accommodate the last flood. Going forward, virtually all of our decisions will need to account for the future risk of climate change. But that's something that humans have really never done before. We need to understand that we can no longer assume that the past will safely guide us in the future, or that the past will resemble the future that we will experience. And that means when we decide how close to build our communities near the river or the sea, or where we should plant our crops or when, we will need to account for how our climate is rapidly changing. When the climate was stable, and that's what we've enjoyed for thousands of years, that assumption that the past resembled the future held us in good stead. But that climate that we've enjoyed for the last 8,000 to 10,000 years is no longer with us. And we are changing at a very rapid clip, and our decision makers need to understand that, catch up, and make the decisions that will better protect us in the future. We can no longer afford to have our world's economic systems teeter atop what one expert called backward-looking risk assessments based on historical trends. But few decision makers, either in the private or public sector, yet account for this changing risk. In the United States, more people have moved into areas at risk in certain areas than outside. For example, since 2009, more than a third of the country's coastal states have added homes in areas prone to flooding. These houses face growing flood risk from more extreme precipitation, those rain bombs, which Houston experienced, with Hurricane Harvey, extreme precipitation falling so quickly that no city is prepared to absorb it, stronger storm surge, and rising seas. We've also seen a boom in housing at areas at great risk of wildfire, and we've seen a number of those housing communities go up in flames. Decisions about land use can increase vulnerability to harm from climate change, just as decisions about how to build can increase our vulnerability to climate change, and decision makers need to understand what they can do to improve the outcomes and reduce their risk to climate change. With climate change, it's what lies ahead that counts. But it turns out it's really hard for people to imagine that future. And so that leads me to my final point. The progress we are making in places like Houston, New York, California, Boston, are leaving out many places across the nation. That's why this convening is so important, to begin the discussion about how we can help the thousands of communities across this nation. You know, we have some 40,000 municipalities that need to make choices about how and where they will build going forward. That's a lot of borders. That's a lot of people to educate, and we need to make this information simple, actionable, and available. Almost a decade ago, I met the part-time mayor of the very aptly named Perdido Beach in Alabama. Her community faced threats from heat, erosion, sea level rise, and storm surge. She told me, I get it. I understand that my community is at risk from climate change. But she told me, I don't have a big planning staff. I don't have grant writers or any resources. So how can I even know the size of the threats my community is facing, and what can I do to help protect them going forward? That question was posed over a decade ago. We are still struggling with the answer. The federal government and others generate enormous amounts of data and information concerning climate change. That information could help make us all safer. Yet we still lack adequate guidance, decision-making tools, and other resources to assist decision makers responsible for determining how to reduce that risk, make the choices necessary in the face of accelerating climate impacts. It's hard to figure out a community's vulnerabilities and what are the choices that could be made. The available resources are not often easily understood or even accessible to local decision makers on the ground. This is our challenge, creating the tools and services to help these communities. So let's all, as we move forward, keep the Patsy Parkers of the world in mind. With climate change, we need to bring everyone along, as Jane has said. The pandemic has shown us, as it showed those first attendees in 1919, what catastrophic risk looks like. Now we have the opportunity to improve outcomes for future generations. As Jane said, we need to be prepared to be surprised. We can't afford continued failures of imagination. So let's think about the convening of this group a century from now. What will they say that we did to address these growing threats to human security, national security, from climate change and other environmental loss? So thanks so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Alice. And this brings us to our last speaker of the panel. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mayor Sylvester Turner of the great city of Houston. In addition to being the mayor, he has leadership roles in the national space. I don't have time to talk about all of these. He's really involved, but I'm going to focus on one. He is the chair of Climate Mayors. It's the largest mayoral organization in the country that deals with these issues, and he is the chair of that. So he is not just looking at these kind of issues in his own city, but across the country as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce the mayor and ask him to make his remarks.
There we go. Thank you, Mike, and it's a little bit loud. And let me say good afternoon to everyone, and certainly to all of the previous speakers. I'm also honored to welcome each of you to Houston, the American Meteorological Society. And let me thank you for choosing Houston, Mike, for the annual meeting. I come before you today, as Mike indicated, not just as the mayor of the city of Houston, but as chair of the U.S. Climate Mayors. There are roughly 474 of us across the United States, from red cities as well as blue cities, and that number is increasing. And I come before you as board chair of the Global Resilient Cities Network. Here this afternoon with me is Priya Zachariah. Priya, just stand up so they can see you. Priya is my director of the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Sustainability. So here in Houston, we are intentionally focused on addressing many of the issues that the panelists have already discussed. I believe that Houston in many ways is ground zero for many significant changes that are occurring as it relates to climate. And we have a responsibility to lead the nation and world in a direction that helps sustain our planet and not destroy it. I'll start off by saying, and most of my comments can be summarized in the sense that there's an urgency, and the urgency is now, that we do need to be proactive as it relates to climate change, but you can't have climate change effective in terms of your strategies without resilience, and you can't have resilience without equity being at the table. We know all too well that while for the last 2,000 years, the global change, climate change, relatively little, in the last few decades, our climate has changed at a rate that is unprecedented, historic, and has brought on devastating impacts. According to NOAA, as of July 2020, the state of Texas had experienced the most climate and weather events, about 119 events since 1980, that caused at least $1 billion worth of damages each, more than any other state. And what this means for Houston is that all seasons are warming, weather extremes are becoming more intense, hot days and heat waves are becoming more frequent and severe, precipitation patterns are changing with more extreme and intense rain events becoming even more destructive. And the overwhelming impacts of these changes are felt in our streets, in our homes, at our communities, our bayous, affecting our vital infrastructure networks and economic systems. In the past 6 years, Houston has experienced 7 federally declared disasters, from Hurricane Harvey that dumped about 52 inches of rain in some areas of Houston. And most recently, with Winter Storm Uri, a historic freeze left thousands of homes and facilities without electricity, disrupted our water infrastructure and systems, and paralyzed our entire state. And what is even more dire is that whether it's sudden shocks or stresses or a slow onset event, it is our most vulnerable communities, often communities of color, that are disproportionately impacted by the compounding impacts of climate change, putting them in a constant cycle of recovery. Climate change is not just an academic exercise or an academic discussion. It exacerbates our housing disparities, healthcare disparities, economic disparities, and for communities that are already living on the margins, they are in a constant state of recovery. But as we know to be true as Houstonians, and as we are tested by our greatest adversities, we also find our strongest resolve and our most formidable spirit to rise together. In the years following Hurricane Harvey, we embarked on our plan to address both climate change mitigation and adaptation. In 2020, I released the Resilient Houston Plan, and shortly thereafter, the Climate Action Plan, two strategies that work together to create short and long-term solutions to tackle the climate issues we are facing while moving Houston forward with a focus on equity. The Climate Action Plan is a set of strategic actions organized along four major pillars. Energy transition. We are the energy capital of the world, but Houston needs to lead on energy transition. Electrifying our transportation fleet, building optimization and material management, recycling, addressing sectors strategically to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Our data-driven approach informs us that more than 95% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the energy and transportation sectors. We use, in the city of Houston, we use more renewable energy than any other city in the country. And as of July 2020, all of our city municipal facilities, all of them, are now 100% powered by renewables. We created Evolve Houston, a public-private partnership to accelerate electric vehicle adoption, access, and awareness in Houston. Our Climate Action Plan calls for creating 4 new Energy 2.0 companies in Houston by 2025. And working with our universities and others, we are now ahead of our goal. The goal is to plant 4.6 million trees in the city of Houston in this decade alone, and we are on our way. In November of 2021, the city of Houston received an A grade for citywide climate action and was named among a new generation of climate leaders as one of only 95 cities across the globe. But even as we are proud of our accomplishments, we also acknowledge the journey ahead of us, and we still have a long way to go. It's no secret that some of the largest polluters call Houston home. We are the energy capital of the world, and that is why it is so important that we lead the energy transition away from traditional fuels to more sustainable practices. If we are successful, if we can do it here in the city of Houston, then the positive impacts can be felt around the globe, and we have an obligation to do that. Whether it's in carbon capture, utilization, and storage, whether it's clean hydrogen, or capitalize on the incredible wind and solar potential we have in Texas, or develop a thriving circular economy, we have the potential to decarbonize Houston and cities across this planet. Managing urban flood risk is another strategy that is central to our mitigation and adaptation efforts, both because of the increasing frequency and intensity of hurricanes, but also because the land around Houston is currently subsiding and is likely to continue to do so. It is likely that the relative sea level rise experienced in the region will be greater than the global average. In our response, we have turned to the Living with Water model, a collaborative problem-solving approach informed by both local, national, and international expertise from the Netherlands and Denmark. We considered recommendations across multiple systems and scales, from the bayou to the neighborhood. Strategies such as holding water where it falls, furthering and incentivizing green stormwater infrastructure, aligning the transportation and bayou network, and exploring the potential nature-based solution as an urban and recreational amenity are all actions in our Resilient Houston to help us further embrace and protect our water assets. As we continue to pursue the goals of the Paris Agreement, we must put equity and environmental justice at the core of our climate action. Through the work with the National League of Cities, we are working to develop a project prioritization framework, an internationally resilient cities network, which I chair, and would have developed the Resilient Infrastructure Diversity and Equity, or RIDE scorecard, a tool to measure the impact of each project based on equity. And as I said before, you can have climate change, but you have to have resilience. And if you don't have equity, you really have not achieved very much. Without adaptation, there can be no mitigation. And without equity in our efforts, there can be neither. And that's an overview of how Houston is weathering the storm of climate and resilience. But time is not on our side. And for people who are already living on the margins, every single time a storm comes, they are pushed down a little bit further. And every time you combine climate change with a pandemic like COVID, they are pushed down a little bit further. For these individuals, this is not an academic exercise. This is real life. It requires real solutions. And my advice to people in Congress, stop playing and let's get it done.
Thank you, Mayor Turner. That was an incredible conclusion to this opening panel. I hope all of you have been able to learn quite a bit from our distinguished panel and help put in perspective the goal of our environmental security theme, which is tying these real world issues to the science that we all know and love and do. And making that connection is why we chose this theme. And I would encourage you all to check out the environmental security special sessions starting in the morning, going all the way through. They do include topics on health security, energy security, water security, food security, impacts of extreme events, as well as special sessions on science and diplomacy, the history of environmental security, and one that's led by our own board of representatives and inclusivity and diversity grade. They're sponsoring our special session on environmental justice. So with that, I'd like to thank once again all our panelists, with Sherry Goodman, Manny Mizzatori, Dr. Tajane Lubchenco, Alice Hill, and Mayor Sylvester Turner of Houston. This is, Mr. Mayor, this is the first time we have been here, but we will be back. We will be back in 4 years and 4 years after that. And we very much hope that we're going to be here in force. But you can tell our future is bright because we all have all our students here today. Next time you'll see them, they're going to be early career professionals. After that, they're going to be running the world. So thank you so much. And I want to actually, while you're here, these are hot commodity. There were fist fights outside looking for these. This is our theme button. I'd like you to take one home with you, sir. If you already have one.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With that, this concludes our presidential forum, and we're going to take a brief break. We can lead into this evening's next event, which is our business meeting and award ceremony. I encourage you all to stay, and really, we're going to be looking at the awards for all of the best of our society. And so with that, thank you for coming for tonight, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes. Thanks.